The University of Texas Institute of Texan Cultures at San Antonio is a learning and communication center for the interpretation of Texas history, culture, and folklore. One of the areas of research at the Institute is the ethnic heritage of the state. To discover the national and cultural origins of a people, the Institute studies the individuals who made an impact on the development of a state. The settlers came from numerous ethnic, cultural, and racial groups, each one influencing the character of Texas. The following is a story of one of those families.
Why are you drifting upon the sea? I'm hunting for a land to harbor me. Why such a stony, sorrowing face? My people are called the accursed race. Once in our land, in diligent labor, we lived in amity, neighbor with neighbor. My mate and I were housed and warm, till the war clouds came like a thunderstorm. At rising sun by lantern light, the stabbing steel, the terror flight. Oh, ghost of a woman I used to be, adrift on a strange and savage sea.
Fania Kruger was one of massive numbers of Russian Jews that immigrated to the United States in the years between 1881 and 1914. The poems in this show are hers. The story also is about her husband, Sam Kruger, who overcame incredible odds to lead a new life. How did these two children of Russia and the Torah come to live in Texas? What part of their culture did they bring with them? How did it feel to be strangers in a strange land? We'll take a look at those questions in the next few minutes, but first go back to the beginning to see what forces catapulted these two people from the oppressive society of Tsarist Russia to a life in Texas. Bert Kruger Smith, the daughter of Sam and Fania, and an accomplished scholar and writer, recalls the stories her parents told her.
I think if I were going to start describing my father's life, I would just call him a survivor, because he was born to the greatest kind of poverty. He was the youngest child. There wasn't food. He really should not have survived. He was a weak child, and they thought that he wouldn't make it, and somehow or other his very determination in a way to survive, I think, is part of his character for all of his life. But he was born into a very poverty-stricken family, with living in a small hut with one room, big oven that was used for warmth, for cooking, for sleeping, and just a little alcove where people could have a tiny bit of privacy. I would say that he was probably as poor as anyone could be. And yet, it always interested me very much that somehow or other learning was still valued even in that family. He learned Hebrew, and he learned prayers, he learned the Jewish rituals, and all of these things were taught by the family. But he certainly talked about how poor they were and how his mother used to try to keep him alive and keep him healthy by giving him a taste of milk if she was putting it into a big pot of soup, trying to save a little bit of food for him. And he was a person who apparently was afraid of nothing from the time he was a little boy, and this carried over. It's a characteristic I remember about him all his life. He would go into a neighbor's vineyard, for example, or orchard, and steal apples. He would manage to survive. He would find food and find ways of living when other people in his family were giving up and sitting around saying their prayers and pretty much considering this the fate of their lives.
While Sam and his family were scraping out a meager existence on the frigid Polish border, Fania Feldman was growing up in Sevastopol, a temperate Black Sea port thousands of miles away. Their lives were a world apart.
Mother, on the other hand, was a young intellectual golden-haired, blue-eyed, a person who had great ambitions about knowing literature or poetry. I guess she was writing even then. It's because she had grown up, for one thing, in a part of Russia that was very beautiful, very mild, where my father had battled cold and snow and ice and chills. She had grown up where it was mild and lovely, where there was a lot of bathing in the Black Sea and where there was a lot of beauty. So that her whole surroundings were different. She did a lot of reading of the Russian writers. And while I used to hear her and my father read it to one another in later years in Texas, I think she probably was the one who introduced him to a lot of Russian writers that he didn't know as a little boy, and that she had valued and really appreciated all of her life.
While Fania was discovering the world of literature and learning, Sam attempted to improve his lot by learning watchmaking. His ambitions were cut short when he was drafted into the Russian army.
Most Jewish young men, if they could, escaped from Russia, left Russia, I should say, before they had to go to the army, because the army, all of the persecution really showed even more once they got into the service. Then they were really terribly treated. And a lot of people would maim themselves. They would blind themselves with pepper in their eyes, cut off parts of their bodies, just anything to keep from having to go to the army. But my father was in the service, and was in the service and on leave when the Russian-Japanese War broke out in 1904. And at that time, he was, as I said, on leave. He was not with his regiment. And knowing that there was a war, he had very negative feelings about fighting for the Tsar, who was terribly, terribly cruel to the Jews. And he decided that he was going to escape. Now, this was not as simple as buying a ticket and escaping. He had to manage, he had to borrow money from different people he knew. He had to manage to go through the channels. There was quite an underground, I guess, and they would ride on wagons at night under hay, and there would be little houses where they could stay during the day, certain people who would keep them, and guards had to be bribed. They were stopped. They never knew when they were going to be killed. And this was a journey of some days. They had to cross the border into Germany, going through icy waters, and he finally did make it. He did get on a boat, which was traveled by steerage, 3 weeks on the ocean with the water sloshing in, people stacked up like cordwood, and he made it to New York.
While Sam was off in pursuit of his American dream, the Feldmans' reality in Russia was becoming a nightmare. Economic and social discrimination were bad enough, but when the Tsar ordered the systematic slaughter of Jews, called pogroms, conditions became intolerable.
My mother's description of what a pogrom had been like was just incredible, because in those days the Cossacks, I guess the Tsars would set the Cossacks out to make scapegoats of the Jews, to take the people's mind off what else was going on in the country. And my mother was walking down the street with her father one day in Sevastopol, and the Cossacks started coming through the town. And as they did, you know, when they'd see a Jewish person, they would simply pull out their swords and kill him. And my mother's father said to her, "You keep walking because you don't look Jewish, and just keep on walking and I will go and hide." And she said she never could get over the fact that this beautiful father of hers, whom she always described as the man with the golden beard and the dreams, should have had to go into a grocery store and hide under a barrel, crouch down like an animal under a barrel to hide. And she had to keep walking even though her knees were trembling, and watch the Cossacks go by and kill people.
That dusk, I, but a girl of 10, witnessed the rage of Tsarist men, the Cossacks, who like winds of hate battered the fence, smashed down the gate, shattered the windows, broke the door, ripped up the boards of the worn pine floor. "Death to all Jews!" Their drunken yell rang through the hut, our hearts as well.
Despite the pogroms, the Feldmans tried to maintain a normal life. But because of their growing social conscience, Fania and her older sister became involved in the revolutionary movement. Becoming uneasy about their daughter's safety, the Feldmans decided to join an older son in Texas. Immigration was a dangerous and frightening experience. From border to port, Jews were the victims of other Jews, smugglers and peasants who played on their fears. Steerage bunched people together like cattle. An early traveler called the trip a kind of hell that cleanses a man of his sins before coming to the land of Columbus. Why America? America was in everybody's mouth, wrote one observer. Businessmen talked about it. Women in the markets discussed it from stall to stall. Children played at immigrating. The reason was the promise of freedom, voting privileges, the choice to make a good living, and most important, human rights. What the immigrants didn't realize was that the promise had its darker side. The poverty in America was almost as wretched. "Curse you, immigration," one immigrant cried. "Accursed are the conditions that brought you forth. How many lives have you broken?" Sam Kruger's disappointment was intense.
He was very disillusioned at first because his distant relative lived as poorly as he had lived in Shershov, and he had thought that everyone in America really lived a beautiful and clean life. But this was what propelled him to come across in 1904 and 5. First of all, he stayed with this relative for a couple of nights, and he saw the roaches and the rats and the filth and decided that wasn't for him. And before he knew any English or had any money, he headed out for, I guess, being in business for himself with the oilcloth suitcase and the clocks. And he began to make a little bit of money and worked a little bit in a jewelry shop. This was fine. He started, saving money to bring over another family member. But then he heard or read that there was oil being discovered in Texas. Now, he didn't know where Texas was, and he didn't really know what oil was, but it sounded good, and he was full of adventure. He decided that he was going to go to Texas, and he got on a train and rode for all the days and made it to Fort Worth, Texas, where before long he had brought another brother over, and they opened up a little, very small Kruger Brothers Jewelers.
Sam molded the dream he had of America and made it come true. His plans were for success. Fania's was a different story. In New York, Sam at least had the comfort of knowing fellow countrymen. But Fania's family came directly to Fort Worth by way of Galveston.
I can just begin to imagine a young, intellectual dreamer who had, I guess, just been emotionally being awakened in Russia because she had this teacher on whom she had a crush and who apparently liked her and had all of these new feelings, and then to be taken out of this beautiful setting and out of this intellectual setting and to come into a place like Fort Worth, which at this point had probably very few, if any, paved streets, muddy, raw roads, probably small wood houses. Everybody came over when the family came in. Everybody came over the first night to see the greenhorns. That's what they called the immigrants, and sat there and talked, about them, but nobody could talk to them because they weren't speaking the same language. And I would imagine that it must have been a great shock. She got jobs in because she didn't know the language well or didn't know it at all. She got jobs in a liquor store carrying buckets of materials. She really had to do manual labor. She was quite a stranger in a strange land, and I would think that it must have been just a terrible, terrible shock for her. She didn't have my father's either drive or toughness. But she never lost her ambition, because what she would do is have her 2 blouses. She'd wash one out at night, press it in order that she could be clean for work. She started trying for better jobs. She went to night school. She began to learn English. Her drive was no less than my father's. It was just different. Her drive was to improve herself intellectually, and his drive, I think, was to be a success in America.
How did this man with the relentless determination to succeed, and this woman with the inquiring mind and indifference to material wealth, find one another?
I told you that everybody came over to see the Greenhorns. The minute a new family came, everybody came over. My father was one of those persons. He was, by this time, 25 years old. He had the little jewelry shop with his brother, Kruger Brothers Jewelers. And here came this family from Russia. And you have to understand, there was my mother, who was 15. She had another sister who was 16, and another sister who was 18. So there were these 3 girls, and my father, who was 25. Well, of course, everybody presumed, once he seemed to have an interest in the Feldman girls, that it would be the oldest, because in the Jewish tradition, of course, the oldest girl had to marry first. And my father, as I said, was a survivor and an undaunted person. It was mother he wanted, but they wouldn't let him go out with her, of course. So for 4 years, he took out all 3 girls, all the time. And he tells the story about my aunt, whose stockings were often wrinkled, pulled down. He would help her pull her stockings up. He would pilot these 3 girls around everywhere they went. Whenever they went out, he was there with all 3 girls. And after about 4 years, the older girls had not married, and they were by this time 20 and 22. I suppose that my grandparents took pity on him and decided if he really loved her that much, they were going to let him marry her. So she was 19 and he was 29, and they did permit them to get married at that time. He looked at this golden-haired, blue-eyed girl who was everything he was not. And I think that this must have been just a whole lot of the attraction, because she was intellectual, and she did, speak a beautiful language, and she was gentle, and she was very non-aggressive, and she was quiet, and she was proper. He was, as he would consider himself, rough and untutored, and all of the things, aggressive, all of the things that she wasn't. And I think that he so admired the wonderful qualities she had. And by the same token, I think that being a very non-aggressive kind of person, she thought, here was a man with lots of strength and lots of drive, and I think that intrigued her.
Given Sam's restlessness and curiosity, the Kruger family was not long for Fort Worth. Promises of oil and more wealth led Sam and his young family to Wichita Falls.
My father, again, heard of this great oil strike, that there was a lot of oil around Wichita Falls, which, if Fort Worth was raw, Wichita Falls was even more so. Wichita Falls, till yet, is, on the positive side, filled with marvelous people. And this, I must say, physically, it is flat, the land is red, the water is hard, the summers are the hottest in the state, the winters are the coldest, and the wind blows the hardest. It is not what you would call a beautiful city. At that time, it was no city at all. And my father took my mother, who was then pregnant, from, no, I take it back. They had an infant. They'd been married a little over a year, and they went from Fort Worth, where all her family was. And of course, Wichita Falls, which was a couple of 100 miles away, was a long, long way away in those days. Took her into Wichita Falls. He opened up a little jewelry store, and she lived, I think it was a garage apartment. No help, this small infant. She was quite the perfectionist. She tried to help Dad keep books, and I would imagine that it must have been a very lonely, frightening, bewildering kind of life for my mother.
Despite the odds, Sam and Fanya worked together to lay the foundation for a new life. A Russian peasant only 10 years before, Sam was now on his way to becoming a successful businessman and oil speculator.
He spent all his life feeding the jewelry business from the oil fields or the oil business from his jewelry store. And at one time, during a big oil boom, he brought in a gusher, which was fantastic. And I can remember riding in this, big square car over these very bumpy roads and going out to the well, which was, shooting fire, I guess, 50, 100, 150 feet in the air. There was just so much oil, and it was just a tremendous thing with, potentials of millions. And I guess it was the next day or so that I was standing in the hall and listened to my father on this, tall telephone, the kind we had. And somebody apparently had offered him $50,000 for an eighth interest, which was, in those days, an enormous amount of money. And my father said, I could hear him talk to this man, and he said, I should say not. He said, if it's worth $50,000 to you, it's worth that much to me, and I won't sell it. And he kept all the interest. The next week, the well went dry. And he was greatly in debt because he didn't have the money to pay off the debts from the well. He never cried, never fussed. He said, well, we'll try again. So we were alternately very rich or very poor, but we always lived the same way. It was a matter of how much debt we were in, and it didn't seem to worry my father any.
In Texas, Sam and his keen business sense and driving ambition thrived. Fanya had her own ambitions. Study and contact with other literary figures honed her talent. Her place as a major Texas poet was being secured. So these two people, our strangers in a strange land, developed new, more meaningful lives, gathering strength from each other and from freedom of expression. Here in this foreign land, their lives prospered. They were also fortunate, unlike immigrants in other parts of the country, in that they were accepted into their community.
I was aware that I was different. I just wasn't aware that this was a negative. I was quite open about being different, and there were a lot of people interested in the fact. And we had people over for the high holy days and for dinners, and people who had Friday night supper with us. All of this was just part of the way we were, and it was something that we all exchanged with one another.
It wasn't until she went away to college that Bert first encountered overt prejudice. She was housed in the Jewish area of her dormitory, separated from old friends both physically and socially. Here, away from home, this young first-generation American began to identify with her parents' experiences. She began to see what it meant to be a Jew, what it meant to be different.
Whenever you were hurt long years ago, I washed the wound and staunched the blood's quick flow, anointing it with healing oil for balm, and kissed your brow. The lacerated palm you soon forgot. You would no longer weep. To words of mothering you fell asleep. Through storms, my dear, you were at rest, lying in slumber on my willing breast. But now despair has come. Since you are grown, I stand by helpless, and you grieve alone. My child, sorrow has come upon you now. I am a bent oak with a stricken bough. For in your days austere, in icy weather, apart, your grief and I, we walk together.
Relying on the strength and understanding she inherited from her parents, Bert was able to overcome the pain of being different and recognize the value of her uniqueness.
I cannot be like you because I was born different. And I think to be the best person I can be is a lot more important. And in being that kind of person, I say, I'm a product of these kinds of values, this kind of experience, this sort of background, and it makes me maybe more interesting to you. It makes you more interesting to me. It's like a tapestry, you know. If you did it all in one color, it would be pretty dull. And I think of these, particularly these other cultures, as being really golden and silver threads in tapestries. And I think we see this more and more lately in the development in many minorities, a kind of new pride and their willingness to share their kind of humor or music or background with other people.
Sam and Fania Kruger lived a full and happy life in Wichita Falls. After Sam's death, Fania moved to Austin and immersed herself in university life. 3 books of her poetry have been published. The Fania Kruger Poetry Fellowship was established in her honor. They will be remembered.
My theory is that nobody really ever dies, particularly people who are really alive. And there is so much that we continue to keep alive in terms of our children and grandchildren, because I think it's very important that they know where they came from and what their ancestors were like and what some of the things, the values that were held. So there are many anecdotes that live on in our family and keep being told. I've written a novel based on my father's life, and it has helped, I think, some people know about him. But there is so much of him that we see in children and grandchildren that it seems to me that people who are as vital as they were do live on. They really never die.
Be steadfast, heart, within a noble calling be sown, though others reap the golden grain. And like the seed where tardy rains are falling, tutored by strength, by toil, you live again.
How did this man with the relentless determination to succeed, and this woman with the inquiring mind and indifference to material wealth, find one another?